Star Trek has had a rich and vibrant history, but what's always surprised me is how little each individual Trek fan knows of its history, either knowing little tidbits and pieces through trivia, or believing myths that have cropped up that have no basis in reality. The Trek fan base deserves a comprehensive retelling of how each of the Star Trek series and movies came to be, and in this series, I'll endeavor to do that. Hello and welcome to Backtrek, a web series that focuses on the background information of any given topic in Star Trek. In today's episode, we're taking a look at all the behind-the-scenes drama that plagued the making of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Please note, having originally done this video as a multi-part series on this channel in its very early days, I thought I'd go back, re-record, and re-edit this video, with some awesome updates I've learned since I originally made it. But for any story to make it into this video, I had one requirement, that it be confirmed by 3 separate sources connected to the show itself. Sources include all the autobiographies of the Star Trek the Original Series actors, interviews of the cast and crew of Star Trek, as well as things such as memos and journal entries, just to name a few of those sources. So, as you can imagine, it was a lot of work putting this video together. Anyhow, sit back, relax, find your Kirk unit, and I hope you enjoy the video. Sometimes known as the slow motion picture, Star Trek the Motion Picture would re-energize the Star Trek franchise while simultaneously being disliked by most of the Star Trek community. Shortly after the cancellation of Star Trek the Original Series, the fan base would explode thanks to reruns being aired everywhere and all the time. And by 1974, it was clear that Star Trek had staying power, and that it could easily become a money-making franchise. So, with the animated series coming to a close, Gene Roddenberry was approached once again to create a new Star Trek as a flagship series for a new network the powers that be were creating. And so, Roddenberry went to work with his team to bring live-action Star Trek into the 1970s. After a few flip-flops between making Star Trek a series or making it a movie, finally Paramount committed to a big-budget Star Trek film thanks to Star Wars exploding across the scene. But bringing Star Trek to the big screen would see a ton of problems. First being that everyone of the original cast had signed on to the movie except for Leonard Nimoy.
The story of Star Trek the Motion Picture rightly begins in London, where my wife and I were vacationing in 1975, in a hotel bar, to be precise. The bartender grinned at the sight of me and then winked as he said, "I'll bet you want a Heineken, Mr. Nimoy." "No thanks," I answered, and ordered my usual, wondering where on earth he'd gotten the notion that I'd want a beer. I soon found out. A few nights later, we went to see Henry Fonda, who was performing on stage in Darrow. After the performance, we joined him and his wife for dinner. At some point during the conversation, Henry said, "You know, Leonard, I hope you're being paid for all those billboards around town." "What billboards, Henry?" "Do you mean to tell me you don't know about all those Heineken billboards?" Turns out they were all over London. There, larger than life, were 3 Spocks facing the viewer. I soon learned that the Heineken billboard deal had been made back in Hollywood. The notion of whether it was legal for my image to be used without my permission had never even occurred to me. But it occurred to me when I saw those billboards. Do they have the right to do this, I wanted to know? Do I have any approval over how my likeness is used? We hadn't received a single check for use of likeness in 5 years. The next bombshell came from the lawyer. It seemed that once Star Trek was canceled, Paramount had no legal right to license my likeness from that time on. You better believe there were a lot of phone calls between my office and Paramount. Add to this legal unpleasantness the Star Trek II incident, and perhaps you can understand why I wasn't chomping at the bit to get involved with Paramount and Star Trek again.
He was refusing to return to Star Trek until his dispute with Roddenberry and the studio over royalties was solved. And second, all the sets and costumes created for the now defunct series called Phase 2 simply wouldn't work for a big blockbuster movie, as they would look far too cheap to be believable on the big high-definition movie screens of the time. So here they were, the middle of 1977, basically starting from scratch and told to make a movie for a Christmas release in 1979. So then, what went wrong? Gene Roddenberry wasn't a movie maker by any stretch of the imagination. He was a writer, one which had gained tremendous fame thanks to Star Trek reruns. He was being credited as the sole creator of Star Trek, and after many fan conventions, he began to believe his own propaganda and forgot that Star Trek was really a collaborative effort, and that conflict within the show is exactly what made Star Trek great. Having Roddenberry head up the movie was a huge mistake on Paramount's part, and instead of creating a new action-adventure story mixed with intelligence and humor, Gene tried to rewrite a story that had been originally intended for the Phase 2 failed Star Trek series called The God Thing. The original story, as laid out, would have went as follows. An unknown space intelligence, a life force very mechanical in nature, making a beeline for Earth. It would be demanding worship from each planet it passed, and would be in a very obvious state of disrepair, though its strength and ability would outweigh anything that the audience had ever seen before in any Star Trek episode. The original series crew, after being hailed as heroes for returning from their 5-year mission, would be scattered throughout the quadrant. Kirk himself would have been offered the Admiralty, but turned it down, preferring to remain a captain, but being given the job of Starship Troubleshooter, heading from ship to ship, surveying a vessel's worthiness for deep space exploration. While visiting the newly refit USS Enterprise, overseeing her new captain Pavel Chekhov, Kirk would find out about this new life form, and he would take command of the Enterprise once again, rounding up all the old crew and heading for a showdown with this space-faring missionary god. Finally facing the quote-unquote God Thing, God would tell the audience how it had traveled to Earth many times before, basically laying out all of the religions for humanity, appearing to the Enterprise crew as Jesus himself. Refusing to help repair God, the God Thing lashes out, and Sulu's leg gets severed. And then it hits Spock, who is presumed dead, and with the enormous amount of energy expended by God, this thing is left weakened and vulnerable. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the Enterprise launches a huge barrage of weaponry firepower and destroys God, and the Enterprise heads on its way, with Spock and Sulu making full recoveries, and Kirk seemingly back in command of his first and only love, the USS Enterprise. It's a fascinating story, but one I can understand why was never made. Apparently, as written, the script was obviously intended to be a slight by Gene against all religions. And of course, something like that, even in science fiction, would not be allowed to be made in the 1970s. The script problems wouldn't end there. After handing in his script to Paramount president Barry Diller, Diller immediately passed on it, but told Gene to take another stab at a story for the movie. Without telling Roddenberry, Paramount also approached other science fiction writers, asking them to submit their scripts for a Star Trek movie. Both Harlan Ellison and John D.F. Black submitted proposals to the studio, but both were also rejected. Many stories from many writers would be considered, debated, pondered over, rewritten, and then rejected. At one point, one story would have seen the Enterprise travel through time and be responsible for JFK's assassination, and even starting World War III. This idea too was rejected, and it seemed like the Star Trek movie was not going to boldly go, as it couldn't even boldly get off the typewriter. But thanks to NASA and its invention of the space shuttle, Star Trek would continue to get a new lease on life with every failed script.
Not since the Apollo launches had the American public become so caught up in space exploration. And with that in mind, the agency's public relations department asked the American public to come up with a name for its prototype shuttle. Immediately, they were deluged by postcards and letters from thousands of Trek fans. demanding it be christened Enterprise. Roddenberry was absolutely thrilled by the turn of events. He'd soon like it even more. Paramount knew there was a growing audience out there ready to spend their money in exchange for the privilege of watching the further adventures of the Starship Enterprise. With that in mind, they not only continued searching for an appropriate big-screen vehicle, they upped the pace. Star Trek, the movie, was now falling upward at Warp 10.
Funnily enough, practically with each failed script, Paramount Studios was upping the motion picture's budget. Starting at about $2 million US, it had now reached a whopping $11 million, and it wouldn't stop there. By the time that Star Trek the Motion Picture was complete, the budget had reached around $46 million. And that's pretty amazing when you consider that Star Trek's return was going to be a low-budget TV series. The actual story that became the motion picture was based off a pilot script again for the failed Phase 2 Star Trek series. This script, entitled In Thy Image, was originally outlined by Alan Dean Foster, based on a story idea he had given to Roddenberry back when Roddenberry was trying to sell his Genesis 2 television idea. After both Gene and Harold Livingston, who was the creative producer for Star Trek Phase 2, read Foster's story, they both agreed it was great, and Harold Livingston himself would take up the task of making it into a 2-hour pilot for Phase 2. Harold and Gene despised each other intensely, and it came to a head over this script.
After a brief period of professional courtesy, the two men developed an intense dislike for one another. Livingston made no secret of the fact that he thought Gene was a fairly lousy writer. Roddenberry, it would seem, had equally little regard for Livingston's talents, constantly churning out unsolicited rewrites of his scripted offerings. Harold Livingston continues. I brought in my script on a Friday afternoon. I gave it to Gene, and he said, "Okay, now you've done your job, let me do mine." He then goes home and rewrites the whole goddamn thing over the weekend. Monday morning, he hands out copies of his revised version to Goodwin, and at first glance, I immediately notice that the cover page now reads, "In Thy Image" by Gene Roddenberry and Harold Livingston. He'd put his name on top of mine. So now we all go into our offices. We all start reading this thing, and maybe an hour or so later, we all finished. At that point, everybody congregated into my office saying, "Who's going to tell him?" So I picked up his script, walked into his office, and while he was sitting there with this expectant grin on his face, I said, "Gene, when something works, you don't piss in it. Make it better." He was furious. He ultimately sent both scripts to Michael Eisner and insisted that he make a final decision as to which one was better. So 2 days later, we go up to Eisner's office, and Eisner's juggling these two scripts, one in each hand, and he says, "Gene, your script is a television script, Harold's script is a movie. It's a lot better." The gasp that came out of Gene was like a shot of thunder, and he never forgave me.
That comment effectively ended any hope of Gene and Harold having a successful working relationship. Gene and Harold were in constant competition with each other. Once filming had started on the motion picture, this rivalry became even more evident. Daily revised script pages would appear from both men, contradicting the pages that had been received earlier, dutifully initialed with their GR for Roddenberry or HL for Livingston. And it became crystal clear that this unholy union simply wouldn't work if Paramount wanted the film to ever be completed. As a result, a few weeks into the filming of Star Trek the Motion Picture, Livingston quit the project, vowing never to return to Star Trek so long as Roddenberry held the reins. With Close Encounters of the Third Kind also becoming a huge box office success, intense pressure was put on Roddenberry to get the Star Trek ball rolling immediately. So with In Thy Image in hand, Gene headed out to price shoot the movie's special effects. See, Gene and Paramount wanted a Space 2001 feel, but that just doesn't work for Star Trek. No one wants to see our favorite Star Trek character staring at the main view screen while 10 to 15 minutes of V'ger shots are playing. It was a bad call that completely bogged down the movie. And to make matters worse, Gene quickly discovered that the effects he wanted for the movie would cost the studio around $10 million just on their own. This was something the studio was not going to be impressed about. After Doug Trumbull had turned down doing the special effects for the movie, it was visual effects company Robert Abel and Associates that took up the task. But by December of 1977, Abel and Associates were in financial trouble, mainly due to the fact that their critically acclaimed Levi's commercial had run hugely over cost. Quoting an initial budget of $4 million for the special effects, Abel and Associates were rapidly increasing the special effects budget by millions, realizing that they had grossly underbid the project. However, part of the ballooning budget's responsibility does fall on Gene Roddenberry. Remember, the script he had taken for the initial bidding was nowhere near complete. As a result, Gene Roddenberry's imagination would go Magatu wild, and he would add scene after scene of new special effects. And so, of course, Abel and Associates would need to increase the effects budget. The first serious clash between the studio and Robert Abel and Associates occurred around Christmas of 1978, when producers and executives stopped by the company for the first time to view what photography had been completed for the movie. Much to everyone's horror, they found that very little had been completed, and what had been produced was either incomplete or entirely unacceptable. From there, things just spiraled out of control. It was quickly discovered that Robert Abel and Associates, instead of working on the movie effects, had been billing Paramount and using Paramount's equipment to make commercials for other companies. Paramount immediately demanded that they desist all side projects and give the final budget figure for all the special effects, which at this point was sitting around $14 million US. They then quoted Paramount a figure of $16 million US. Doug Trumbull was brought in by Robert Wise, who himself had been brought in to direct the film and get this project done. Trumbull was an unpaid technical consultant for the movie at this point, trying to help the studio regain control over the entire situation, though this only made matters worse. Trumbull was a visual effects pioneer, being responsible for the special effects of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. However, Trumbull was also known to be very difficult to work with. Robert Abel was similarly known to be headstrong and stubborn, so inevitably the two would clash, continually butting heads with each other over the special effects themselves. Ultimately, Trumbull was not able to get Abel and Associates back on track, and the situation proved to be unsalvageable. On February 20th, 1979, when studio executives and producers once again came to the company, they were shocked and appalled to find that Robert Abel and Associates had only a single completed effect shot for the show after all the time and money spent by Paramount. Feeling betrayed and lied to, Robert Wise demanded the company be pulled from the project, and in total agreement, Paramount fired the company 2 days later. Robert Wise's feelings may actually be understated, as Abel and Associates would end up threatening to sue the studio over perceived injuries sustained by Robert Wise's full-blown rage statements. In turn, Paramount itself began a criminal investigation into Robert Abel and Associates, after being informed that Abel had sold off some of Paramount's own equipment. When all was said and done, however, the entire situation would end up being settled out of court, with the exact details of the settlement being unknown. There would only be one Robert Abel and Associates visual effects sequence to make it into the final cut of the movie, and that was the wormhole sequence, though the V'ger light probe and bridge sequences would be credited to them, as they had pre-planned and designed the entire sequence. Nevertheless, the studio and Wise were now in somewhat of a panic, not having any special effects house to finish everything they needed for Star Trek the Motion Picture. They began to frantically search for one. Coming to the rescue would be Doug Trumbull's own visual company known as FGC. With a budget of $10 million US and pressed for time, Trumbull would get straight to work. To get everything done, Trumbull was forced to subcontract to Apogee Incorporated in order to divide the workload to get the effects done in time for the release date. Apogee was operated by famed cinematographer John Dykstra, a former protege of Trumbull. Together, working some major overtime hours on the project, they would produce some of the most beautiful Star Trek effects ever created. Trumbull, however, suffered from nervous exhaustion upon completion of the work and had to be hospitalized for 10 days. Realizing one of Star Trek's main drawing points was the character of Mr. Spock, Paramount considered for a very brief time replacing the actor with a new look-alike. Ultimately, however, with Wise's urgings, they decided that the film needed Leonard Nimoy, and so they immediately set out to settle their disagreements with the discontented actor.
But I knew I'd be hearing sooner or later from the studio because in the summer of 1977 I'd seen a movie called Star Wars, and it had blown me away. At the time I said to myself, you're going to be getting a call from Paramount. Indeed, I did. Fortunately for us all, it came from a young man named Jeffrey Katzenberg. He was a studio executive at Paramount, and he asked to see me in New York where I was appearing in Equus. The weekend Jeff came to visit, he mostly listened while I talked. He gave the impression that he wanted to be truly helpful and fair. We frankly discussed the difficulties I was having with the studio. After several hours of talks, he asked whether I'd be willing to look at a new script for a Star Trek movie. I told him I didn't feel comfortable doing that while the lawsuit was still going on. He accepted that, and we parted on good terms. The tension was building. Word was out that a Star Trek movie script was written and that other original cast members had signed on. Did I want the Enterprise to sail without me? No. But I had faith that the matter would soon be settled. And soon Robert Wise was signed to direct. Mr. Wise believed Spock to be important to the film to the degree that his own contract with Paramount required the studio make its best efforts to settle our differences. Finally, my lawyer called. Look, Paramount's actually showing some willingness to reach an agreement. Would you read the script if they settle the lawsuit? Yes. 4 days later, on a Friday evening, the lawsuit settled. My lawyer came to my house with a check. An hour later, the script arrived.
And Nimoy signed on to the movie to reprise his role as Spock. The main problem with the story for the movie was that Gene had no idea how to end it. By the time filming started, only 2/3 of the script had been finished, and as a result, oftentimes the cast members would learn a page of dialogue, set up for that scene to be shot, and then suddenly a new page of revised dialogue would show up and they'd have to start the process all over once again. This bogged down the filming schedule to no end.
Finally, Livingston quit the project. With his departure, Leonard and I began trying to help out wherever we could, often meeting with Robert Wise and Roddenberry, attempting to smooth over the script's potholes and rewriting much of Kirk's and Spock's dialogue so that it better suited the characters. By the time Halloween had come and gone, we'd been shooting for almost 3 months and we still hadn't finalized the last act of our film. With that in mind, every morning at 7, Leonard and I began meeting with Bob Wise, Livingston, and sometimes Gene Roddenberry. Our already turtle-esque pace became downright snailian.
Back when Phase 2 was in production, Pierce Escambada and Stephen Collins joined the original series cast as 2 new characters. Persis being the Delta Navigator, Lieutenant Ilea, and Stephen as the new First Officer, Commander Will Decker, the son of the Commodore Decker seen from the original series episode, The Doomsday Machine. And Gene would set about creating a relationship between these 2 characters. Incidentally, Gene would use this relationship between Ilea and Decker as the basis for the relationship between Will Riker and Deanna Troi in Star Trek The Next Generation. Pierce Escambada's character of Ilea was to be bald, a trait of her Delta native species. And in order to achieve the desired result of this alien species, Persis actually shaved her head, something she had been dreading since signing on to the production for Phase 2, and when Star Trek barbers went to work, she openly cried about it. Sometimes we underestimate the lengths an actor will go to in order to embody the soul of their character. Persis was a true professional, and her amazing acting ability is certainly one of the highlights of the motion picture. David Gautreau's character of Zahn, the full Vulcan who desperately wanted to understand humanity, would not be included in the movie. Instead, David would be given the role of the commander of the Deep Space Station Epsilon 9. Though all happy to be reunited, the cast of Star Trek the Motion Picture did have one big problem with the movie. That, of course, being the new one-piece style uniforms.
I hated our new uniforms. Ugly, form-fitting, pastel-colored one-piece jumpsuits. These things itched even worse than our old TV series dogs. Far worse was the fact that due to the design of these outfits, it was virtually impossible for any male member of our cast to sit down without seriously endangering his ability to procreate. All day long, our set was peppered with the pitiful, high-pitched yelps and wailings of castmates discovering this particular design flaw for the first time.
Incidentally, the narration of most of the film trailers was actually done by Robert Wise's friend Orson Welles. That's right, the man who made Citizen Kane was the voice behind introducing Star Trek the Motion Picture to television audiences around the world. The final problem with Star Trek the Motion Picture was that Robert Wise, the director of the movie, had to edit the film while they went along in order to make the release date. Normally, you'd have months, if not an entire year, to edit a film together. But this was not the case with Star Trek the Motion Picture. In fact, he finished the edited version of the movie just before the premiere, and had no time to review what he had edited together as a whole. In late 2001, Robert Wise would release his director's cut version of the film. This version would be shorter in length, with a much tighter storyline cut together than we had ever seen before. The visual effects would also be updated using CGI technology. Though a much better version, this edited version is still seen by many fans as just being too slow and too boring. The premiere itself took place in KB MacArthur Theatre in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of December 1979, and was really a mixed bag. Everyone agreed that the movie was spectacular, and visually they were correct. The reveal of the new Starship Enterprise, the shots of V'ger's insides, etc. were very artistically done. But when you stepped back and reflected upon the movie, two things became very apparent. One, that the movie was way too long, filled with unneeded special effects, and far too many reaction shots of the crew endlessly staring at the main view screen. And two, the story really wasn't that great, feeling like a rehash of already done TOS episodes such as The Changeling. The cast, though pleased with the film, thought, okay, this is it. We made a Star Trek film. It didn't turn out great, and now it's back to the unemployment line. But of course, that was not meant to be. Star Trek the Motion Picture had become a paradox, the successful flop, if you will, thanks to Star Trek fandom. Desperately craving for new Star Trek, and wanting not only to show their support for the franchise to Roddenberry, Shatner, Nimoy, and the rest of the cast, they all flocked to theaters. Not only once, but multiple times, paying to see the film over and over again. And because of this, Star Trek the Motion Picture made over $139 million at the box office. Subtracting the film's budget meant that Star Trek the Motion Picture had made Paramount a hefty profit of $93 million, or about $354 million in today's money. Not bad for a flop, right? Gene Roddenberry himself would even attempt to capitalize on Star Trek once again, adapting Star Trek the Motion Picture into a full-length novel, including in it many of the ideas that he had tried to pass by Paramount back when he and Harold Livingston were arguing about whose script was bigger. I mean better. Having spent the money on sets, visual effects, etc., Paramount decided to make another Star Trek movie. This time, however, there would be many changes to that movie's approach, along with the smallest budget ever for a Star Trek feature film. And yet, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan would end up becoming one of the most beloved Star Trek movies of all time, finally cementing Star Trek as a successful franchise for both Paramount and the fandom at large. But of course, that's another story. Thank you for watching today's episode of Backtrek. What do you think of Star Trek the Motion Picture? And all the great little tidbits of information I've provided you here in this video. Do you want to see more videos like this one? Well, leave your comments in the section below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. Want to help the channel continue to show its love of Trek through videos like this one? Then consider becoming a channel member subscriber or a channel patron. Both a major help that allows this channel to purchase resources and 3D models to keep it going. The link to both memberships is in the description below. Thanks again for watching. Live long and prosper.